The housing in South Africa is generally of a good standard. There's good availability of both furnished and unfurnished accommodation. The furnished is typically apartments. The one thing that overlays all housing considerations is safety and security. In Johannesburg, they tend to go for the gated communities, which are in the far north of the city. They are also in close proximity to the American International School, so typically they're the most popular choice for expatriates and for companies as well. Cape Town's a very different city. It's a very popular tourist resort, so during the holiday season, a consideration is availability because houses, particularly furnished accommodation, rents for very high daily rates. There's Durban, which is a city on the east coast of South Africa. There's a reasonable amount of movement into the city, but Johannesburg is the sort of hub of both entry into the African continent and South Africa. So the majority of the volume is there. South Africa is very like Europe. You can terminate the lease on 2 or 3 months' notice after a fixed period, and the leases are rather more tenant friendly than they are, for example, in Kenya and in Nigeria. There's a perception that Africa is cheap. Which is certainly not the case. Rentals in Johannesburg are paid monthly. They're nothing like as high as they are in Lagos, for example, or in Luanda in Angola, which is probably the most expensive housing pretty much in the world. So they would be comparable with slightly lower than, for example, London, but they're certainly not cheap as is often perceived. The most critical thing when choosing a house in any of the locations in Africa, especially with families with children, is to consider the school first. Traffic congestion obviously is a big consideration in many of the capital cities, and choosing the school first and then linking the housing and perhaps the work location is the one that comes third. We have, in South Africa, they're exceptionally good private schools, but also international schools. There's the American International, French, German. So reasonable availability in the international schools. The private sector is very oversubscribed. It's extremely difficult to get into the good private schools with very long waiting lists. In terms of high school children, obviously the transition back to their homeschool education is a consideration, and that's probably one of the key factors in selecting, for example, the international schools over and above the private schools. There is no acceptable public transport in any of the African cities. So in South Africa, for example, typically one would have 2 cars if it's a family. The driving is not as sort of compliant as one would find in the Western world. They're minibus taxis that don't obey the rules of the road. They stop wherever they want to stop. They take on passengers. So one needs to have one's wits about one and keep a safe following distance. South Africa as well as the rest of Africa, safety and security is obviously the key concern for assignees anticipating taking an assignment into those locations. And it covers a broad spectrum in terms of safety, health, driving, where you choose to live, taking common sense precautions. And one of the other factors is the importance of a pre-assignment visit, because very often that will allay concerns around safety and security. In Johannesburg, homes would always have alarm systems, even if they are in gated communities, and those would be linked to a security control room, and that's just good best practice. Relocation to Africa is challenging, but can be terrifically rewarding. There's a huge amount of poverty, a lot of work to be done. Mostly Africans embrace investment. It gives them an opportunity to be trained and, so exciting but challenging. I think probably the first one is take advantage of a pre-assignment visit. It's really important to get a sense for whether you can actually live in the country. I think the second one would be to be really well prepared in terms of just practical things like having medical checks done. So, considerations, doing research, asking questions. The third one maybe would be cross-cultural training. The thing about Africa, I suppose it's the same with all locations, is not to offend and be sensitive to the host nationals. And clearly, the more one knows about them and the more one knows about their culture, the easier it is to be sensitive to those issues. The fourth one, I think another consideration is that the spouse and partner can't work. So some thought needs to go into how they're going to keep themselves occupied. There are options, for example, like continuing your education, staying linked to your home country, doing consulting services, or obviously volunteer activities. And the fifth one, I think, is probably have a great sense of humor. The locations are entertaining. The people are absolutely wonderful. They're warm, hospitable, but there are significant challenges.